Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. The midterm elections are less than 3 months away, and part of the American political discourse is about alleged communists taking over the country. But in fact, it seems that diseases are taking over the United States. Is the US becoming a country of measles and diarrhea under President Donald Trump? David McEwen, a political science professor at Sonoma State University, is one of the Global Agora's regular guests. We discuss the state of play before the midterms, what the vote can bring for Democrats and Republicans, and how labeling opponents as communists can help the GOP. And yes, we also talk about measles and diarrhea, and inevitably about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. David, I hope you don't have a problem with measles or diarrhea. Why do I mention this? We are witnessing measles and cyclosporias outbreaks in the US, and while these are health issues, it seems they also somehow reflect the current American political environment. The Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is an infamous anti-vaxxer. Even though now under pressure, he said he supports measles vaccination, and the Trump administration is so full of anti-regulation types. So with all due respect to your homeland, is the US becoming a country of measles and diarrhea under President Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can do two things. You can look measles nationally, right? And we hit in June a number of measles cases that exceeded the previous year. And then you could look at a deeply blue state like California, a state where measles has also hit a record compared to last year. So you have a state that, is very diverse. It has a number of elements that would include people that are anti-vax, but also are wanting to be healthy and wanting their kids to be vaccinated. And even in a state like California, you had record-setting numbers. You also have this notion of MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, which is going to be highlighted in a midterm convention later this month for the Republicans, where Secretary Kennedy himself will be highlighted with the MAHA movement because they see this link between Healthy America linked with anti-vaccine growing as key to the MAGA coalition and to energizing voters. So that means, no disrespect intended at all, that the reemergence of measles and perhaps other diseases is going to capture this notion of the United States being dramatically different in its approach to health. But let's make this clear. This is a minority or small segment, an important segment of the MAGA movement, and an energized segment that the Trump administration needs to offset gains and losses that have occurred, gains by Democrats, losses with independent voters, and some elements of the MAGA coalition due to other issues. But nonetheless, healthcare and the healthcare debate moving forward is an important element here of what's happening in American politics. I'm glad that we start with this because also there's another element here. The pro-RFK Jr. forces that were part of his kind of backing before he joins the administration and have continued are not just passionate, they are like over the top in terms of their view of what should happen. And we just had a long-term study that came out, and that study showed that there's no long-term link between vaccines and autism, and further kind of complicating the arguments that they're making. And I want to make it clear that the arguments they're making are emotional and passionate. They're not scientifically based. So the broader element of your question is, look, there's a loss of scientific expertise. There's a loss of respect for experts and what science does. And also that spills over, for example, to journalism and the media, arguing that, look, all of this is a pack of lies and fake. And that's that element of dismiss and malinformation that's a key element here for how the Trump administration operates.
Does Trump politically really need Robert F. Kennedy Jr.? I very much believe that his horrific beliefs are killing Americans.
They are killing Americans. There's no doubt about that. Two elements here I want to talk about. One is Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, has tried to manage a White House that has been off message since January. It's been off message on its economic messaging related to the midterms, where it's been the president seems much more interested in monuments and in building than he does in trying to push forward accomplishments that are really good for the American people or good for our allies or friends like those in Central Europe. Now, that has led nonetheless to people staying in the administration, right? Kristi Noem is out, right? You see Pam Bondi out. But in general, since they have come into office, they've remained whole. The rumor has been for months that after the midterm elections, they suffer some losses. And in the December-January timeframe, that would be the normal time when people would leave the administration. And the big rumor has been that RFK Jr. would be out at that time, replaced by Dr. Oz, for example. Now that we are what looks like to be over the Todd Blanche AG nomination, now that we're returning less than 3 months to the midterm elections, it would take the course of a normal second-term administration that there would be a loss of members that are cabinet secretaries that Susie Wiles has tried to keep whole and keep everyone together in this second term. So you would expect someone like RFK Jr. to go or others to go, that there should be some element of turnover. Given that this president does things differently than anyone ever, and he takes great pride in that unevenness and that uncertainty, it could be a wholesale sea change. You could see changes that could affect others up to perhaps Marco Rubio, but not including Marco Rubio, because he likes that bromance rivalry between Rubio and J.D. Vance. But short of that, you could see a lot of changes that occur in the December-January timeframe. And I think for our European friends and our European allies, for geopolitical instances of what's going on from Europe to the Middle East to Asia, that's something that folks are looking at in a deep, deep way. Is these midterms are really a pivot to whether Donald Trump is going to be a lame duck, which he's going to hate, but really also a pivot to the wide open 2028 presidential elections and the time between November of 2026 to January 2029, when the next president is sworn in, is going to be a fantastic and uncertain time in American politics, which means the rest of the world is going to be watching as well.
Do you think Pete Hegseth will stay?
I believe that as long as the Iranian conflict has settled into a place that's constant or long-running, a war of choice, and the combative nature of him, he stays. If there is a settlement that occurs that is stable, that is not low-level ongoing conflict, then if it was a low-level ongoing conflict, he stays. If it moves to a place where this is like all out, there could be some changes that occur, I think. He is a guy who, look, Trump likes his combativeness. He likes that he gives it out to people. And the difficulty is, can he get over the hump the additional allocations beyond the huge allocation of the budget, the supplementals that occur? Can he help with that? The one thing that hurts Pete Hegseth is he's not good on Capitol Hill and doesn't have those relations. So if we get to a place where the budget is stuck, where any type of additional allocations to the Pentagon are stuck, and here's where that matters in terms of time frame. The current agreement that it looked like we've settled on is December 11th. So if there is nothing after December 11th, that would be the time frame where there would be changes that would be announced, similar to what we just talked about, perhaps with RFK Jr. or others in the cabinet, in terms of an overall kind of shuffle. So that's kind of the time frame. Right now, he stays.
David, as we speak, and you already mentioned this, we are less than 3 months before the midterms. The dynamics can change, but according to polls, Democrats lead Republicans on the generic ballot by 5 to 8 points, let's say so. How much should Trump and the GOP be worried? But of course, as the narcissist in chief, Trump would never blame himself, and he just says that voters are angry at Republicans, but they are not angry at him.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to the president, most of America is in favor of the Iran war. If you listen to the president, his popularity has never been higher. If you listen to the president, all things are kind of moving forward. Americans aren't worried about gas prices. That's all a fantasy. However, Democrats have some challenges and some problems. So let's kind of lay this out. In a president's second midterm election, which is what this is a second midterm election, the average midterm loss in the House is about 33 seats. So that would say that things are close right now and that Republicans should lose. The generic ballot, if it's above 5 points for the out party, and this is historically the case, except for 3 midterm elections since the Civil War in the United States. So it's a really rock solid kind of rule, even though Trump upsets all of our known kind of rules over the last 10 years or so. But look, midterm loss should be a regular occurrence for Republicans, which means the House would be a loss. And the president's talked about this. He's talked about this off and on, and he doesn't see himself as on the ballot. And Republicans on the Hill know that he's on the ballot and believe that he's on the ballot. So as a result of this, nonetheless, what you see is we should see a House midterm loss. But it should not be as dramatic as that 33 seats, a wave election like we saw in 2010, for example, where Republicans are swept in over the battle over Obamacare, or 2018 when Democrats come in, Nancy Pelosi comes back, because the Democrats have some challenges. So you look at approval, disapproval, right? And the president's disapproval is the highest it's been, or his approval hovers around the low 30s. As his approval gets back above 38 or 39%, that is the key element for your listeners. If he gets above 38 or 39%, his midterm losses will not be as deep. Why? Because he has a hardcore coalition that stays with him at above 90%, and he brings in some independents. 38, 39 is a tipping point, if you will, where losses start to pile on more deeply, or a steeper part of the curve. Joe Biden's number was 41, 42%. So it's a little bit higher, or the losses occur more easily for Democrats and for Republicans because of the Trump coalition. But there are a couple of what ifs to this. Are voters angry enough to overlook the Democratic civil war that's going on between Democratic socialists, what I call moonlighting Democrats like Bernie Sanders? They moonlight in the Democratic Party. Are voters angry enough to look past that to vote for the Democratic Party, which has low approval, but not as low as the president himself? And so the favorability of parties is way down. And where that's important in these midterm elections is for independents, or what we call the purple people. That's one condition. The calendar is another condition. Ballots go out in some states in September. In California, they go out 29 days before the election. But basically, if we say it's about 90 days away, voting starts in about 60 days. So the election is upon us, if you want to think of it that way. The third factor that mitigates what's going on are the maps. Republicans have a map advantage because of redistricting. There are about 37 to 40 competitive seats. About 18 of those are true toss-ups, about half that number. The others kind of lean Democratic and lean Republican. So the number of toss-up seats is very narrow, and so the expense for those is going to be very deep. Finally, Republicans have a huge dollar advantage. The RNC has about $400 million in cash attached to the MAGA element. And Trump has given no indications. This is an important element. They have a $400 million advantage because Democrats, the DNC, is about $2 million underwater, in the red, if you will. Trump's given no indication that he wants to spend the $400 million kind of MAGA RNC money on behalf of Republicans in the House or the Senate. So the Senate becomes a much more difficult animal for Democrats to get because they need to flip 4 seats. And this is where the civil war with Democratic socialists between mainstream Democrats becomes important in a state like Michigan, when El Said wins that primary, because Michigan has been a Democratic Senate seat since 1994. That was the last time Republicans won under Spencer Abraham, serving 1 term. So if Republicans were to flip that seat in Michigan, it makes it really difficult for Democrats to net 4 seats overall.
With regard to the midterms, and of course we know he will never admit it publicly, but how much do you think Trump regrets that he's starting a war with Iran?
Yeah, I don't know that it's in his psyche or mental makeup to say that it was a mistake, but I'll explain it a little bit differently. Vladimir Putin has been trying to conquer the Donbass for 13 years. Vladimir Putin engaged in a war of choice in Ukraine as part of a longer running, whatever, set of ideals. Our president engaged in a war of choice with Iran when he didn't need to, which is also the first time in recent memory that the United States engaged in a war with 0 European support, with 0 European allies, and without the support of the American people, without a majority support of the American people. Sure, it started out at like 41%, 43%, something like that, but less than 1 out of 2 Americans supported that war with 0 European support. That is clearly a war of choice. Now, would he say that that's a mistake, or anyone in his administration? They would never say that. They would never draw any quarter in that regard, but clearly it is a war of choice. And the lesson to be drawn and the parallel there is, look, it's been 4 years of a Ukraine war where the Ukrainians have done amazing things, as you've documented in your own work, as we've noted, and they have received, if you will, a push as the underdog. And that's something that should have some draw to the Trump administration, that the underdogs against the Russians have held their own. And the underdogs, the Iranians, have held their own and have been able to control both the Strait of Hormuz and virtually shut down the Red Sea at the same time at Bab al-Mandeb, which is a really big deal in terms of expanding their influence and influencing what happens in the Gulf. As a result, you see a potential nuclear deal, not just with the Saudis, but also with the Emiratis. That occurred as well. And that, of course, gives pause to the Israelis in terms of what's happened in the Middle East overall. So these wars of choice have dramatic short-term, medium-term, and I would say really over the horizon, longer-term consequences. And that means domestically that the price of gas does matter in the midterms. And just for your listeners, Labor Day is about the time that voters lock in sentiments around the midterms. So it's basically between the 250th, July 4th, to Labor Day that voters lock in their sentiment. And if gas is at record highs, and it looks like it will be close to record highs, if not at record highs, and the economy is still kind of just slugging along, households are worried about affordability, that's never a good thing for the End Party.
I think that we can say that the Trump administration has mounted quite aggressive effort to expand federal oversight of elections. But in fact, its streak of courtroom defeats in its effort, for example, to obtain state voter rolls reached 21 this year. So not very successful. But do you have any concerns about the elections in terms of democratic processes? Does Trump have any tools at disposal that can influence the elections in his favor?
He does. I am not of the view that the sky is falling, but I'm really worried about it being held up by the pillars of our judiciary and our judicial system. I'll give you an example of one of the four horsemen of this apocalypse. I give a lot of talks and a lot of interviews about what potentially could happen. And let's say that the president tries to have some way to push people away from the polls. And this would be particularly acute in Georgia, where John Ossoff is running for re-election. It would be very acute in a state like Virginia or even Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is challenging the incumbent senator there, and Democrats are trying to have a pickup. So it would be selective. And I even think you could see potential orders in a deeply blue state like California to kind of push back at this rivalry between East and West, between Gavin Newsom, if you will, and President Trump. As you look at that, then votes are cast. And then shortly thereafter, there's a calendar that takes over that culminates in the lame duck session in December before the new Congress is sworn in January. During that time, as we enter into the lame duck, California is still counting ballots. So the way that Democrats take over the House, even in a modified wave election where maybe they currently forecast to win about 30 seats, 28 seats, that could change. It could be double that given the volatility of what's going on. But let's say Democrats look to win the House and Hakeem Jeffries would become the next speaker. The route to that is through upstate New York and through California. New York counts their ballots pretty quickly. And they would be within, a week or two, a couple of weeks of November 3rd being done. But California is still counting. Let's say California is the state that puts Democrats over the top to take the House with new members of Congress, but they are refused to be recognized by Speaker Johnson and by the current Congress headed to the lame duck session. That is a nightmare scenario that would have to go to court and would take months. It's entirely possible that while California continues to count, that new members of Congress are not sworn in, are not recognized, because Congress is allowed to recognize their members. And that has occurred from time to time and been substantial. It's a way really to reject members who might have a scandal above their head. This type of thing. In this late 60s, some examples of this, some other examples. Nonetheless, California is still counting. Then California certifies, but the lame duck's been going on, and California members aren't sworn in or recognized to put the House in the hands of the Democrats because it's still locked up in the court. Might have to go to the emergency docket of the Supreme Court. They may or may not handle that, but the legal proceedings that would be occurring at the state level before they get to the federal appeals level and move through the federal process up to the Supremes and the Supreme Court, that is the nightmare scenario. And that indeed has a possibility of occurring because Congress would not recognize the new members until they're certified and they've been vetted in a variety of components there legally. And those legal challenges have been exhausted. And those legal challenges could carry into the early year. When that happens, our friends in Central Europe like you and other astute observers of American politics are going to say that we resemble a banana republic. That's the nightmare scenario.
So let's look at the Democrats. And of course, the big news of the last couple of days has been the primary victory of the leftist progressive candidate Abdul al-Said in Michigan. I would argue, and maybe you won't agree with me, but I would argue that many policies of the left wing of the party, such as universal healthcare, are in general popular with the American public. But can the left build general election coalition capable of beating Republicans? You said that there is a civil war ongoing within the Democratic Party. Is this really that dramatic?
Fantastic question. Thank you. Look, in 1968, the Democratic Party has a split over the war. They have a split over the war and what's going to happen with Vietnam. That's internal. It's, yes, a proxy and a push against the Nixon administration, sure, against what LBJ did. But the reforms that come out of the nomination process, the reforms that come out of the Democratic Party after 1968, for all intents and purposes, were equivalent to the Great Schism preceding the Reformation. I mean, they were akin to a civil war in many ways. Republicans did the same thing, but after 72 for a variety of reasons. Now, if you look at today, you see an element of where voters are at. There's a very interesting poll published by the Pew Trust, by the Pew Research Organization at the end of July. And it looked at kind of the state of America, where things are at. This was published the last week of July. And it found that a majority of Americans, not a plurality, a majority of Americans were so frustrated with our political system that they wanted to have dramatic changes to our politics, our elections, how things operate in the states that would require constitutional change. And that is just unlikely. But it gives you a state of mind for where people are at. That's not all about affordability. That's about a frustration about how politics goes. If you look at what the DSA, the moonlighting Democrats, the Democratic Socialists of America, are doing and where they're successful, they are really successful on the economic messaging around affordability that then tethers to or is connected to healthcare, for example, or tethered to housing, or tethered to college. So if you look at housing, healthcare, and college linked to household affordability, that's where the Bernie Sanders wing has a great deal of grab with the voters beyond the Democratic Party with some independents. However, when they move into the culture war and foreign policy aspects, that's where they begin to kind of wither or becomes much more problematic. And I would argue that's where the civil war takes place. Younger voters, 18 to 30, have a different view of Israel than older voter subsets, whether they're in the DSA, or the Democratic Party, or as independents. They believe that the pictures they saw and the graphics they saw related to Gaza constituted a social justice, human rights issue. So they have a very different idea about United States foreign policy relative to that part of the world. And again, it is a generational change. So that foreign policy aspect has been very acute when you look at El Said and how he talks about the United States relations. It's led to a huge anti-Semitic kind of push, which the Trump administration is trying to exercise for political advantage, especially in colleges and universities. But more broadly, you've seen some of the rhetoric that is anti-Semitic. In addition, if you look at culture war issues, the wokeism component of this, that is hugely divisive as well. And so when we look at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we look at kind of the broader kind of what we might think of as thoughtful analysis about diversity in the United States, the DEI components at the DSA, pushing forward on those things, on wokeism, is also very divided because the United States and U.S. citizens, voters, have a real sense of fair play, and they're unsure about that fair play. So that's where things like reparations because of slavery, reparations because of bad race relations in the history of the United States, that's where things begin to break. So the economic messaging is strong, right, for DSA. The culture war wokeism breaks, and the foreign policy components begin to break. And that leads to this divisiveness, this civil war within the Democratic Party, which Bernie Sanders would argue is a turnout problem. The way you overcome this is turning out and bringing in more voters, more independents that are disaffected by Trump, more disaffected young people. And we always have a problem in midterm elections with younger people showing up in big numbers and disaffected voters who get turned off. So they have a turnout election. Base plus is what it's called. And Republicans have an election where they're going to try to lower turnout because they're worried about what's going on based, for example, like on your previous question of including some nefarious elements around how the election is conducted itself. What Republicans will then do is they will then treat the DSA, they will treat Democrats as socialist extremists. They're going to say that they are extremists who are socialists, communists who have gone too far. And that's what you're going to see at that midterm convention later this month. And that's the rhetoric you're going to hear from Donald Trump. While he likes Mamdani, while he likes many of these folks one-to-one, he and others in his party are going to paint them as extremists. And the degree to which that latches on or catches amongst the American voter will lessen the pull and the turnout and the ability of Democrats to win in November.
But really, because in fact, I wanted to ask you basically to wrap it up about this, because Trump and Republicans are increasingly attacking Democrats by saying they are communists and so on. Communism is no longer a far-fetched threat. It's here on our shores. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, wrote on social media recently. But it sounds like somehow a new Red Scare, maybe even dumber thing. And really, Americans care about this because, yes, I think we can have a genuine conversation about what the Social Democrats are doing and what they're believing in. But people like Mamdani or El Said, or not to mention Sanders or AOC in Europe, and that would be, the mainstream Social Democrats, maybe socialists, but there are socialist parties all around Europe. So is this really that important for Americans?
Okay. So that's a fantastic question, because you can see such different perspectives. If you've lived in Europe, worked with Europeans, if you've done this, you're like, yeah, this is not what this is. Okay, it is an important scare tactic because it does a couple things. One worry Republicans have is the base doesn't show up because they're disaffected because of the war, because of gas prices, because of the things that Trump seems to be occupied with. Monuments over household finances and a better economy and hope for a better day moving forward. So the charge, the DSA folks have taken over the Democratic Party, they're winning, that they're going to federalize and socialize everything, a la they're communists, is an important element of their view that this mobilizes their base. It's about getting that 33, 35% out. They also think it has some draw with elements of less educated, undereducated, independent working class voters. They think it helps there. And so often you see people vote from an angry kind of place. They vote against things, not for things. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to agitate the no vote to give you a yes vote on the Republican side. I hope that makes sense. Your negative stimuli works much better. I call it junk food politics, right? You consume it. You don't feel good afterwards after eating it, but that's where the voter's at. It's that negative stimuli that works. And people like Speaker Johnson, like Republicans, the president's pollster, Patrick Ruffini, talks about this and digging into this. These are not disaffected voters who are independents. These are non-voters. So this is about taking, when you look at what's your approval, disapproval of Trump, the number is generally, say 60-40, 65-35, but it's really not that. It's really like 60-30. It's really 55-35. There's like 4 or 5% of people who have no opinion of Donald Trump. And there's a formal term for that in political science. We call them liars. And that's because they do have an opinion. They just don't want to tell you it's an extreme opinion. So the stimulus effect of going negative allows you to draw out voters that otherwise wouldn't be there. And there has been this continuous war in the Democratic Party. But that's because there's been Bill Clinton organizations that were created in the 1990s that still exist. There have been moderate organizations within the Democratic Party and around the Democratic Party that still exist under Obama and Biden, under Secretary Clinton, that have still existed. And there has also been a continuing element of activists in the DSA that are reflecting the frustrations that we see in that Pew poll, that where folks are feeling that America's best days are behind it, and neither party has an answer. And this affects the favorability of the in-party, but also the challenging party. And that leaves a mix in the middle where this extremism can be used to moderate or mediate or push people out to vote.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.